Chapter 21. You can't have your cape and eat it, too. As anybody will tell you, no superhero is complete without a cape. I mean, without a cape, a superhero is just a guy wearing fancy underwear, or in this case, not so fancy underwear. But Captain Underpants knew what had to be done. He reached up with his free hand and courageously untied his cape, valiantly sacrificing his aesthetic integrity to save the life of a mere mortal being. Captain Underpants and Miss Anthrop were now free, but they weren't safe yet. The Bionic Burger Boy swung at our hero with all of his might. Captain Underpants weaved around Melvin's frantic, flying, phlegm-flinging fists as he tried to find a safe place to land. Suddenly, Captain Underpants' 100% cotton-powered vision spotted George and Harold miles away. With lightning speed, he flew down to meet the boys. "George and Harold," said Captain Underpants, "you've got to keep this woman safe while I destroy that robotic slime ball." "Okay," said Harold, "but hurry up. Here he comes." "Wait," cried Miss Anthrop. I didn't get a chance to say thank you." She turned and kissed Captain Underpants all over his face with wet, drooly smooches. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she said between each sloppy kiss. "Yuck," said Harold. "I sure hope she doesn't thank us," said George. When Miss Anthrop had finished slobbering all over Captain Underpants' face, she gave him a great big hug for good luck. "Now go get him, Tiger," she said coyly. But Captain Underpants didn't move. He just stood there, staring blankly into space. Off in the distance, George and Harold could hear the Bionic Burger Boy approaching. Each thundering footstep brought the horrible beast closer and closer, until at last he stood towering above them, panting heavily and dripping profanely. Miss Anthrop screamed and ran away. "Hurry, Captain Underpants!" cried Harold. "Do something!" "Yeah!" cried George. "Kick his hiney! Kick his hiney!" But Captain Underpants didn't move. He didn't fight. He didn't fly. He didn't kick anybody's hiney. In fact, the only thing he did do was get very, very angry. "What the heck is going on here, Bubs?" he screamed. "And why am I standing here in my underwear?" George and Harold didn't like the sound of that. Chapter 22. Welcome back, Krupper. If you read the comic on page 7 of this novel, then you know what happens whenever Captain Underpants gets water on his head. Unfortunately, Miss Anthrop's wet, slobbery kisses had produced the same effect. Captain Underpants had been turned back into Mr. Krupp, and now he was about to be turned into lunch. Snap, 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 snap. Quickly, George and Harold began frantically snapping their fingers. Snap, 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 snap. Again and again they snapped, but Mr. Krupp's face was still slimy and wet with gooey kiss juice, and the snaps were having no effect at all. The mighty mucus monster shoved Mr. Krupp into his gummy mouth and swallowed him whole. And then he came after George and Harold. "Help!" screamed George. "We're doomed!" screamed Harold. Chapter 23. Sulu saves the day! Halfway across the city, a plucky little hamster with bionic ears heard the terrified cries of his two best pals. Quickly, Sulu jumped out of his exercise wheel and crashed through the side of his plastic cage. Then, with a mighty leap, he bounded from the window of George and Harold's treehouse. At that very moment, Melvin was dangling George and Harold high above his mouth. "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the Bionic Burger Boy. "Me got you at last!" "Well, goodbye, Harold," said George. "See you later, pal," said Harold. "It was fun while it lasted." Finally, Melvin let go of George and Harold. The two boys screamed as they fell face first into the gooey, gaping mouth of the... Swoosh! The next thing George and Harold knew, they were flying sideways at an incredible speed. Everything around them was a blur of motion, except for the sight of their little buddy Sulu, who had literally grabbed them from the murky mouth of death at the very last second. "Attaboy!" cried George. "Hooray for Sulu!" cried Harold. Sulu set George and Harold down on the roof of a distant building, then returned to the scene of the crime. He grabbed a few oversized novelty items from the tops of some warehouses and turned to face his mortal enemy, the Cane Warehouse, Boxing Glove City, the Denture Emporium. Chapter 24, the incredibly graphic violence chapter part 2 in Flipperama. Warning, the following stunts were performed on closed streets by a highly trained professional hamster. To avoid injury, please do not grab oversized novelty items from the tops of warehouses and beat up giant monsters with them. train tops keep falling on my head. Yummy, yummy, yummy. I got glove in my tummy. A hard day's bite. Chapter 25. How to reverse the effects of a Combinatron 2000 in one easy step. The Bionic Burger Boy was defeated. He flopped, unconscious, into a giant boogery blob that spread across several city blocks and nearly 4 whole pages as reporters surrounded his massive oozing body. Soon, Melvin's mother and father showed up with the Combinatron 2000. We saw what was happening on the news, they said, and we want the world to know that we're going to create a new machine that will reverse the process that turned our son into this monster. If we work together, it should only take a few months to build. Why don't you guys just take the batteries out of that combiner thingy and switch them around, said George. Wouldn't that reverse the machine's effects? Well, laughed Melvin's father, obviously you don't know anything about science, little boy. You can't expect to reverse the effects of a highly complex cellular molecularizing combinatron by just switching the batteries around. That type of thing only happens in obnoxious children's books. Ahem, said George self-consciously. Well, why don't you just give it a try anyway? All right, said Mr. Sneedly, rolling his eyes and smirking. He quickly switched the batteries around and powered up the machine. But I'm only doing this to prove a point to you kids. It's not gonna work. No way. Not in a million years. And anybody who thinks it might is a complete idiot. It goes against all the popular laws of logic and science. He aimed the newly reconfigured Combinatron 2000 at his son and fired. Chapter 26. Blast! Suddenly, there was a terrific explosion. The Bionic Burger Boy burst into 3 huge chunks of glistening soot and twisted metal, which smacked onto 3 nearby buildings and stuck like glue. In the center of the explosion, surrounded by smoke, stood Mr. Krupp and Melvin. Well, what do you know, said Mr. Sneedly. My idea worked. George and Harold rolled their eyes. Now, step aside, kiddies, said Mrs. Sneedly as the 2 scientists marched off to tell the reporters all about their brilliant and inspirational scientific breakthrough. But as the smoke around Mr. Krupp and Melvin began to clear, it became obvious that they were not quite back to normal. Apparently, the newly reconfigured Combinatron 2000 had accidentally morphed Mr. Krupp and Melvin together. Don't worry, Mr. Sneedly told the reporters. All I need to do is zap them one more time. That should set everything straight. He fired up the Combinatron 2000 again and prepared to blast away. I sure hope this separates their bodies, said George. Me too, said Harold. Blast! Chapter 27. To make a long story short, it did. Chapter 28. A happy ending. You know something, said George. This is the first time one of our books actually had a happy ending. You're right, said Harold. Usually they end with me screaming, oh no, and you screaming, here we go again, but we got lucky this time, I guess. What do you mean, lucky, said Mr. Krupp. It was my invention that saved the world. You guys are so immature. Huh, said George. I want to see both of you bubs in my office pronto, yelled Melvin. I'm going to punish you boys so bad your kids will be born with detentions. What? Said Harold. Suddenly, a giant extendable octoclaw reached out from one of the 3 huge chunks of boogers. It grabbed the Combinatron 2000 out of Mr. Sneedly's hands and smashed it to smithereens on the ground. Mr. and Mrs. Sneedly ran away screaming as the 3 humongous robotic booger chunks came to life. Slowly, they began dripping down the sides of the buildings, with each one energizing itself with a single twin Turbo 9000 SP5 Kung Fu titanium lithium alloy processor. As the huge booger chunks oozed closer and closer, they began sprouting strange-looking metallic eyeballs and huge menacing robotic limbs. Suddenly, the 3 ridiculous robo-boogers leaped toward George, Harold, Sulu, Mr. Krupp, and Melvin. And the chase was on. Oh no! Screamed Harold. Here we go again! Screamed George.